That's some music written by Béla Bartok. Let's learn how to play it. Béla Bartok was a 20th century composer with whom many jazz musicians, myself included, find great affinity. He not only was an extremely meticulous composer that embraced modernist harmony and melody, but he wrote some really rhythmically driven music. Bartok often borrowed folk melodies and elements from folk dances from his native Hungary, which kind of infuses a lot of his music with this really rhythmic drive that's kind of irresistible. To show you what I mean, let's check out the fifth movement from his fourth string quartet. So that was basically metal, and it was written about 100 years ago. Bartok's string quartets in particular, like the one that we just listened to, provide a very fertile ground for study for us bass players because even though they're very harmonically and melodically dense, they're still very foundationally rhythmic in a very logical and musical way. Today we're going to take a look at an excerpt from the third movement from his first string quartet, which was written in 1909. So even after a century, it still feels very modern and fresh. And actually, before we do that, fun fact, Béla Fleck of Béla Fleck and the Flecktones was named after Béla Bartok. Also that annoying bat character from the movie Anastasia. So whenever I like to play string quartet music on bass, I like to play the cello part because the cello is the bass voice of a string quartet.
This is a bass guitar, and it's the exact same thing, but instead of playing like this, you tip it on the side, cello, you've got a bass.
The string quartet has two violins, one viola, and one cello. And bass guitar sounds an octave lower than cello. It's a transposing instrument at the octave. So what that means is whenever we play the cello part, everything's going to sound down an octave. There's a few things to keep in mind though. With the cello, you actually have the note low C, which the electric bass doesn't have unless you happen to have a 5-string. If you just have a 4-string bass, you're going to very often have to transpose notes up the octave to the cello's register. In this particular passage, I'm playing the B and the B flat and the bass register an octave lower below the cello, and then the C and the C sharp in the cello's register up an octave. Classical double bass players very often have something called a C extension, which helps them to get those really, really low notes down an octave from a cello. Like that note, but down an octave. So the very first thing that you see when you're taking a look at the cello part to the third movement of the first Bartok string quartet is this thing, which is a tenor clef. It's a movable C clef where middle C lies on the line in between the little two curly Q things. Now, why would you even have a tenor clef? Why not just write it in bass clef or, God forbid, treble clef? Well, it used to be considered very difficult to read ledger lines, so what composers did is they took movable C clefs and made it so that whatever part you were playing would lie upon the 5 lines of the normal staff. There used to be a total of 5 movable C clefs. You had the soprano clef, the mezzo-soprano clef, the alto clef, the tenor clef, and the baritone clef, all corresponding with different vocal ranges. Nowadays, there's really only 2 which are ever used. There's the alto clef, which is kind of the default clef for viola players, and then there's the tenor clef, which sometimes classical double bass players and cellists and bassoonists and trombonists, yes, have to use. It's kind of a pain because it's a little archaic, but you will see it occasionally. A good trick for reading tenor clef is pretending that it's bass clef and then transposing everything up a perfect fifth. For example, the very first 2 notes of the third movement from the first string quartet in the cello part are B and B flat, but it looks like it's E and E flat if you pretend it's bass clef. Moving on from this tenor clef nonsense, a very fun thing that we get to do in Bartok string music is something called the Bartok pizzicato. Now, normally classical musicians play pizzicato with sort of a little bit of a demure pluck for most circumstances, and Bartok wanted something a lot more aggressive than that. So he had his string players take the string and sort of rebound it off of the fingerboard, completely similar, in fact it's exactly the same as our pop, as in like our slap or pop as electric bass players. Now normally Bartok pizzicato is written like this, but very often when interpreting the Bartok string quartets, sometimes classical players might sort of throw in the pizzicato in more aggressive pizzicato sections, even if it's not explicitly written. So that's kind of what I did here when I did some popping on the pizzicato section. Now this is a little bit of an interesting notation here. This means that you're going to be playing eighth notes, and it's kind of a music copyist shorthand so they don't actually have to write all of the eighth notes out in this measure, but also visually it's kind of nice. You don't have quite as much information to soak in, all you need to know is play eighth notes for this whole measure. Now when you're playing this music or any sort of string quartet music, it's really important to listen to recordings, and one thing that you're going to notice when you're listening to the recordings is that string players in classical situations very often have a different understanding of rhythm than what you might have. As a bass player, we generally want to strive for very metronomic even rhythm because we want to sort of lock in with a drummer who also, hopefully, fingers crossed, also has metronomic even rhythm. With string players in classical situations, however, there's a little bit more ebb and flow to the time. For example, when you're getting louder, you're gonna get faster, and then when you're getting softer, you're gonna get slower. Different ensembles and different recordings have different variations of this idea. The one I'm using from this particular video is from the Belcha String Quartet, and I really like their particular rhythmic concept, and I've learned a lot from it. Anyway, here's my interpretation of the first minute and a half or so of the third movement from the Bartok First String Quartet. I really wanted to emulate the aggressive bowing, the scratchy bowing of the Belcha Quartet. They really like to dig in, so I thought, well, how do metal bass players play? Brian Beller talks about something he calls the chime, and that's something that I think about a lot, where you're kind of going through the string with your index finger and you're not really getting the meat so much as you're sort of attacking kind of almost like a right-hand slap with your index finger. So let me sort of show you. That's the sort of tone production that I was thinking about, because if I was going for that sort of burpy, typical jazz, mid-rangey sort of sound, it would not have blended very well with the rest of the strings. Anyway, I hope you enjoy. Hope you enjoyed that. Please comment, like, and subscribe if you've enjoyed this lesson. And as always, bass.